Hello, welcome to Third Act Faith's General Meeting for May, featuring an interfaith discussion about the sacred right to vote. I'm Betsy Bennett, co-facilitator of Third Act Faith, along with Kathleen Dixon, who is helping to keep all of this going behind the scenes. We thank you for joining us this evening, and we especially want to thank Jim Antal and our panelists, whom you will be meeting soon. Third Act is a community of older Americans who are working together to preserve our climate and our democracy. Much of Third Act's work gets done through working groups. While most working groups are defined by geographic area, some are affinity groups that are organized around the skills and interests we bring from particular careers or passions. Third Act Faith is an affinity group that draws on our lifetime formation in a variety of faiths and spiritual traditions, grounding our work in our spiritual roots, a sense of the earth as sacred, and moral traditions focused on compassion and justice. We have a lot of rich conversation to take in this evening, so I invite you to do two things. First, if you have questions for our speakers, please write those in the chat. And second, join us in taking a moment to get centered by sitting comfortably, closing your eyes or focusing them on something other than your screen, and enter into a brief period of silence to prepare ourselves to listen to our speakers. Let us begin. Again, thank you for joining us, and welcome to everyone. Next, Tricia Tall will introduce our this evening's speakers.
Hi, everyone. So glad to have you all here. I'm very, very excited about this panel this evening, and I hope that you are too. We're very much looking forward to hearing what they all have to say. And I want to introduce them to you so you know a little bit about them. First, the host of the panel is Reverend Dr. Jim Antal, whom you've seen before in Third Act Faith. He serves as special advisor on climate justice to the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ. His 2023 book, which is an updated version of his Climate Church, Climate World, is being read by hundreds of churches. From 2006 to 2018, he led the 350 UCC churches in Massachusetts as their conference minister and president. He has preached on climate change since 1988 in over 400 settings and has engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience on numerous occasions. Reverend Antal is a founding member of Third Act Faith Working Group and a member of the coordinating committee. Next, Rabbi Stephanie Kolin is a rabbi of Congregation Beit Elohim in Brooklyn, New York. She previously served as the rabbi of Union Temple, as the rabbi of Central Synagogue in Manhattan, and associate rabbi at Temple Israel in Boston. Before moving back to New York City, Rabbi Kolin was national co-director of the Union for Reform Judaism's Just Congregations, then the community organizing arm of the Reform movement, and lead organizer and a founder of Reform California, a statewide campaign of reform congregations to work for a more just and compassionate California. Rabbi Kolin is an Auburn Seminary Senior Fellow and is a contributing author to the Reform Movement's book on social justice, moral resistance, and spiritual authority, Our Jewish Obligation to Social Justice. Next, Mubarak Elamin, an immigrant, humanitarian, and social justice activist, has contributed significantly to various boards, including OneAmerica Votes Muslim Council, and WASAT. Currently, he is associated with AMEC and Uncommitted Washington, or WA, you'll have to explain that to me. Mubarak's impactful journey also includes serving as a senior advisor to Congress on technology and cybersecurity. His ongoing commitment extends to collaborating with progressives and faith-based community organizations, all united by a shared goal, building bridges and breaking barriers for a more inclusive and compassionate world. And last, we welcome Reverend Carol L. Devine. She is the director of Blessed Tomorrow, a coalition of diverse religious partners united as faithful stewards of creation. She is an ordained pastor in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. She has pastored congregations in Kentucky and has been part of Disciples regional staff. She recently worked at Lexington Theological Seminary, where she earned her MDiv. She also holds degrees from the University of Kentucky and Transylvania University. Carol founded and directs Creation Care for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ as the Minister for Green Chalice and has partnered with Eco America through Blessed Tomorrow since 2015. So welcome to all of you. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your conversation, as I know everyone else here is. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Tricia and Stephanie and Mubarak and Carol. I'm so delighted to join you in this conversation. I'll get us started with just a few opening reflections. I want to begin by pointing out that the preservation of our democracy and the restoration of our climate have at least two things in common. The first thing is this: for the vast majority of our lives, we have taken for granted a stable climate as well as a stable democracy. It's worth remembering that everything we call civilization depends upon a stable climate, and everything we understand as freedom depends on a stable democracy. Both are now in jeopardy. The second thing preserving our democracy and restoring our climate have in common is this: living as we are in a time such as this, the two most responsible ways for a person of faith to show their faithfulness is first, to uphold our sacred right to vote, and second, to leverage our abilities, our time, our networks, and our assets to protect and restore God's great gift of creation. For anybody who believes in God as creator, in a time of climate chaos, working to protect and restore God's creation is obviously a sacred act. But what about working to protect our democracy? In a time when authoritarians are gaining power all over the world, a time when more than 20 states have passed restrictive voter laws, gerrymandered their districts, and implemented countless other strategies to discourage and suppress the votes of people of color, of young people, and of poor people, I believe that working to protect every person's right to vote is a sacred act, because every person has a sacred right to vote. This view is rooted in one of the foundational theological cornerstones of our Abrahamic faith traditions. Human beings are created in the image of God. Or to put it another way, we all have within us a spark of the divine. So long as a person is a citizen, is 18 years of age, and is registered, that person has a right to vote. It is no longer a privilege reserved for land-owning white men and denied to others, as America's founding fathers sought. Voting is a right, and assuring that all citizens who are 18 years old or older have ready access to register and to vote is a sacred duty, because voting is the way each person's God-given voice will be heard. I'm guessing that we can all affirm what Jim Wallis says plainly in his new book, The False White Gospel. Jim Wallis says, the battle over voting rights going on right now in America will determine every other issue we care about. To put it another way, let me share a line from my essay, The Sacred Right to Vote. Voting is about what matters and who counts. Because each one of us is created in the image of God, we should all count. That's why the right to vote is sacred. But voting is also about what matters. For a person to recognize what matters, that person must have ready access to accurate, factual, and truthful information. That's why freedom of the press is essential to a functioning democracy. But Americans are now drowning in a sea of disinformation, distrust, alternative facts, and fake news. This is so commonplace that many Americans have given up on the possibility of actually understanding a complex issue or a problem. And in place of understanding it, they simply take one side or another. Which side they take most often depends on their preferred news source and social media. To put it another way, the majority of us are driven by ideological affiliation rather than assessment of the facts. Just as voting is a sacred right, so too is access to the truth. That's why Jesus told his followers that the truth will make you free. And every religious tradition has some version of what is part of the core of the Abrahamic faiths. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Once again, I'll quote Jim Wallis. The truth, how to find it, trust it, and live by it, is core to both faith and democracy. And the truth problem we now confront may be the single biggest threat to our democracy. Remember, voting is about who counts and what matters. And if truth is compromised, corrupted, displaced, or discarded, we lose our moral compass, and we are left with no idea of what matters. There's one more factor that's important, something I regard as the greatest threat to both democracy and to climate restoration. I am haunted by our human capacity to normalize almost anything. With each passing season, while more and more people recognize that climate change is making the weather more extreme, the vast majority of us are passively accepting this new and threatening reality as we reset the baseline of what we consider to be normal. The same can be said about droughts, floods, food shortages, climate mitigation, and other shocks to the system that should upend our expectations. I have a lot more to say about this in my book, Climate Church, Climate World, but tonight our focus is on voting. So once again, here is the parallel. If voting is a sacred right, why are so many pulpits silent? When districts are gerrymandered, or the lines at polling places in predominantly Black districts are 3 hours long, or the requirements to register to vote are changed to make it almost impossible to register. Well, thanks be to God, recognizing that the 2024 election will be a test of our democracy and faith, I want to celebrate a new, nonpartisan, multiracial, multi-faith, and multi-generational organization. Its name is Faiths United to Save Democracy, and I urge you to check it out. Focusing on the states of Alabama, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Wisconsin. Faiths United to Save Democracy provides clergy and people of faith with resources and strategies to overcome the assault on our democracy that seeks to make it more difficult for voters who are low income, Black and brown, elderly, students, and those who are disabled to exercise their sacred right to vote. In addition to learning more about Faiths United to Save Democracy, here are a few more suggestions for action both congregations and clergy can take to preserve our sacred right to vote. The first thing people of faith and clergy need to do is to talk about the crisis in our democracy and talk about it as a moral crisis. Share with others your recognition that because we have been given life at a time when the centuries-long experiment in freedom and participatory democracy is under threat, as people of faith, it's up to us to speak up. Not only that, but it's also critical that clergy preach about our sacred right to vote and the crisis of our democracy. Clergy are trusted messengers, and so it's up to us to urge the people in our congregations to take action to protect our democracy. And finally, we all need to commit to telling the truth. By telling the truth, we counter the rampant disinformation that's flooding our media sources. By telling the truth, we do one more thing. Truth is the foundation of hope. For hope to be authentic, it must be founded on truth. If we place our hope on something untrue, we eventually realize it's a false hope. Because I believe that hope is the most important contribution people of faith can and must make in a time such as this, it's critically important for us as people of faith to stare reality in the face. We must be willing to face the political reality that there are individuals, groups, and entire industries devoted to spreading misinformation and lies about past and future elections, candidates, and voting procedures. If hope is essential to people of faith, then exposing the lies perpetuated by the powers and principalities working against democracy must become a first-order priority. People of faith cannot stand idly by and allow the destruction of our democracy to be framed as an ideological dispute by people who use their unlimited financial resources to influence the votes of our elected officials. Thanks very much for this. And now we turn to our panelists. Okay, everybody, here's our first question. From your tradition, or speaking for yourself as a person of faith, how do you understand the relationship between democracy and climate action? How would you place the right to vote in relation to these? Maybe Mubarak would get us started.
Well, hello, everyone, and good evening. It's really a pleasure to be with you on this panel. It's great to hear you, Brother Jim, for this beautiful narration of this really insightful, very, very thoughtful. And I don't know what else I can add to what you just said. You know, seriously, you made it very hard to go and talk about anything in the, democracy or the right to vote. But I'm just going to share a little bit more about my experience with. I've been on both sides of the aisle. As an immigrant, I lived in authoritarian regimes, so I kind of have that view of what it looks like when the absence of democracy and what people cherish about America and cherish about the system of government in the U.S. And this is very important, thing for me personally, because I came to recognize this is not something that you hold lightly, but you really, advocate for, you fight for is very, very important, for all of us to understand what we have first. Yeah. And from my, to just share a little bit more about my personal experience as, seeing what authoritarian do, and they do, the first thing that they do, they take your freedom. They take your freedom to actually even think, they control the narrative, they control even how you approach your, personal life, not the public life only, So it's a very terrible, thing to think about. So when you come to a place where there is freedom, there is democracy, and then you recognize, the things that you have are primarily around the freedom to express yourself, the freedom to be able to, speak up for what you believe in, the freedom for me personally to come in here and say, yeah, I'm in America, but I'm also a Muslim, and I can actually claim my identity, and I can claim my identity as a Muslim, as a Black person, as a person of color, as and like somebody said, like, you're not one thing at a time, you're all of these things, you're all of them at the same time. So I come to practice my faith in everything that I do, and I try to also contribute to the community around me through the lenses of what I can hold true to my faith. And part of the Abrahamic, as a Muslim, and I belong to this family of the Abrahamic tradition, I find myself, I'm just a continuation of a whole thing that is started way, before the Prophet Muhammad, may peace and blessing be upon him. And then I'm carrying on. Even sometimes I find the interpretation when I try to kind of try to prepare for this, I found myself going more of the time going to some of the Christian traditions, some of the Jewish tradition, to kind of, what does it say about that? So because we all kind of, move on the same stream. Now, we might have different lanes, but it's the same swimming pool, as I see it, we're not going anywhere away from that. So, and when I looked as an activist, I look at the, at democracy, for me is where I can see the checks and balances. I can see, the differences, where I can see the value of having, legislative body versus having, executive body, and having just the separation of these institutions is so important. And the moment that you see those are crossing and there is play there, you see that that's actually leading to, it gives me, the signals, how we can move into authoritarianism. and how we move into that. It's slightly, it's a kind of, there is a sliding slope into that space. And also, I think something that Jim, you touched on was really like, also the media and the information and what is coming from there. So something that I learned from a friend of mine that I met last Friday, she ran for a city office, in the city council here in Seattle. And I was talking to her, and she said, although I did not win, I actually lost that election, but I elevated and I lifted the issues of the environment and the climate, and the importance of taking, action on that, and how important it is. And although she did not win, but all of her opponents, they took on that issue and they became more of center to their campaigns. So it's really very important for us to kind of actually not to think about it's a winning or losing proposition, but it's also always like is a culmination of work that we need to do, specifically when we're fighting for something as important as the environment. And from the way we talk about this within our own community is primarily through the lenses of what did we learn from the prophet's life, and everyone from any tradition, I actually invite them to center their prophet into that and say, if that prophet is here today, what would he or she do, And that's really the core question. Like, what are we following when we look at these traditions? And so we see that, like, at the time, the prophet was really pioneering and deeply rooted the Islamic teaching in certain principles. Okay, and those principles are the holistic view of nature. That's really like, there is a holistic view of nature. That, and you spoke to it, like, if we're in the image of God, where did we come from and who are we? That's the oneness of God, and then the oneness of the creation and everything that is came, whether it's animals, human beings, forest, trees, water, whatever, it's all the same source. So it did not come from, each one came from a different space. And as human beings, then there comes to the question of the stewardship and the trust that we have given. So we are the kind of the privileged to be the steward of these resources, of these natural, beings, of these of the environment, of everything around us. We are the caretaker of that. So there is a concept of the caretaker and the concept of trust, which is those are two things that really comes from the core of the traditions. And the other thing is, like, also, how do we sustain that, and how do we share these resources? Are they for us to own and accumulate and all of that? And there is a big lesson into that as well. Yeah, we can accumulate money and become more financially resourceful, and then that might be the way to influence other things. But I think for when we talk about the natural resources, that's when we learn from these traditions that we need to be able to share. We need to be able to think about that. And I always reminded of what happened in 2020 when we were talking about what did we learn from 2020? What did we learn from COVID? We learned that we're not isolated. We're all interconnected. Okay, so whether interconnected locally, nationally, globally, there's all different levels to it. So the interconnectivity, that means everything that happened to us here, it kind of has a ripple effect somewhere else. So, and that again come to the issues that we're trying to uphold here, whether protecting the environment, protecting the climate, and restoring nature. When we talk about restoring nature, a lot of people bring in some discussions around, okay, well, is it the pre-industrial revolution? And then let's talk about who is really making the big mess, and then how do we fix that? So we have the responsibility. We have to be able to look at that and look at ourselves from those lenses and those optics as well. Now, when we
Mubarak,
come to the voting,
thank you, but let me see if Carol or Stephanie want to jump in on this. Okay, thank you very much. Carol or Stephanie, which of you would like to add some perspective on the relationship between democracy and climate action?
I'm happy to jump in, Jim, and Mubarak made me think of a lot of things as well. But one of the things that, as you were speaking, that I was reminded of was the lies that we have been given, that some people call fake news, but through climate and through the fossil fuel industry and the plastics, and we have bit on that hook, line, and sinker. I can speak for myself as somebody who really, really celebrated recycling for so many years. So I'm thinking about the money that flows through and then convinces us that we're the problem, and instead of owning it themselves. So the whole false narrative there. But also, as you were talking, and you of course brought up that we were all created by God, imbued with God's spirit. But as a Christian, I'm called by Christ to care for the most vulnerable. And when we think about voter suppression, when we think about racism, when we think of so many of the issues that democracy, when it's done right, protects and cares for, we are called to do justice on behalf of the most vulnerable. And that, of course, includes creation. That, of course, includes the hurting earth, the groaning earth. And also, I would just also add that Jesus was super political. And if, for those who are Christian, identify and try to follow him, then we can't pull away from and not be involved and feel like it's not our area. And I think I've been chewing on the word since you invited me to participate in this. That word sacred in terms of with voting. And I've struggled a little bit with it until I really started chewing on this, as each person and all creation is holy. Then I have a sacred right and responsibility to care for all that is holy and sacred, which includes all human beings, which includes all of creation, and in particular, the most vulnerable among us. And I guess those are the things that I'm chewing on, and Stephanie may have others to add.
Stephanie.
Thank you. I'm truly honored to be in this conversation. And I love this question because I think we can get stuck in like our issue area. Like, well, I'm working on climate, or I'm working on these rights, or I'm working on poverty, and working, all of the things that our hearts are called to and that our traditions call us to do. What does it all have to do with democracy and voting? Corporations in this country are profoundly powerful for all kinds of reasons. They're considered people. They get to, donate a lot of money to get the elected officials to deregulate them. Like, there's a lot of sway that big oil is going to have in this country. But on election day, Exxon doesn't get to walk into a voting booth and pull a lever if you're younger, or, if you're a little older, or, color in a circle if you're a little younger. It's just people, it's just us, it's just our base, it's just our congregations that get to walk into that space and exclusively support the candidate that we believe will vote for and write and execute legislation that will protect and create safety for generations to come. So it's true that, of course, we can organize in all kinds of ways all year long. in the public square and in the people's house. And we can be there, and we have to be there, building a base of power that can make change all along the way. But I think the voting booth, and Carol, I think to your grappling with this word sacred, I do think the voting booth is particularly sacred ground. There's this midrash in Jewish tradition, this ancient story where right in the moments following, immediately after creation is sort of complete, and everybody's sitting back, and there's the Garden of Eden. God takes Adam through the Garden of Eden and says, look at this beautiful created world. Look at how exquisite this is. Do not destroy it, for if you destroy it, there will be no one who comes after you to repair it. It's not corporations that are going to be suffering the consequences of elected officials who stick with the status quo or follow that sacred financial bottom line. Corporations are entities. They're pieces of paper. They're agreements and contracts. It is the human beings and our babies and our children and the most vulnerable on this planet and future children who haven't even been born yet. All of it. It is we who will feel the consequences of all of that. And the only thing that's standing between people having our voices heard and big oil getting to do whatever it well pleases is the right to vote in free and fair elections, because our leaders are going to go on and they're going to make decisions about everything that has to do with our lives, about education and healthcare and our bodies and climate. And so I guess I would say that voting is what makes elected officials accountable to us and our families and the most vulnerable of this earth. And voting equally is the way that we have the power, the lever that we have to then remove somebody from power if they don't live out and represent the voice of the people who want to breathe this air and drink this water and not have disease and not live in a sacrifice zone. This place where we've just decided those people don't matter. Those primarily Black and brown people or those poorer communities, we'll just give up that for our luxury or our convenience. It may well be time to exercise, our sacred power on sacred ground to make sure that our elected officials are our mouthpiece out there where they have to make decisions, or enact legislation or pull whatever levers have to happen such that we change trajectories and point ourselves towards a different horizon.
Well, Stephanie, you're on a roll here, and you may just want to continue, because I think what you just said pertains to this next question, and you may have a little bit more, and that is, what concerns you most about the current attempts to restrict voting? What suggestions would you make regarding how faith communities might take action in response to the attack on voting rights?
Yeah.
You go first, Stephanie, because you went last the last time. Go ahead.
Thank you. I believe in fairness. It's so nice. So I wanted to bring, I think this question is really important too. There's this ancient text. I love when ancient texts could be written yesterday. It's just such a great, they knew things that we should still know right now and have lost somewhere along the way. There's this text, this Talmudic text, it's talking about why Bezalel was appointed to help Moses and the people build the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness. And it says that one may only appoint a leader over a community if you and once you consult with the community. It doesn't say once you consult with the elders or the most powerful or the wealthy or the white dudes. It says the community. You cannot legally, halachically, you can't appoint a leader that's going to represent the people until you talk with the people and find out what they want. So, of course, as you said so wisely, voter suppression often takes place against the most vulnerable communities, the people who most need their voice and most have trouble having their voices be amplified in the halls of power, Black and brown communities and poor communities and rural communities too. And I would say that voter suppression, what worries me most, it is among the, if not the most cynical expression and acts perpetrated in our country today. It is truly, utterly cynical, right? Because it's like compassionless efficiency. Elected officials get to leapfrog over listening to the voice of the people. What's their lived experiences? What are their pains that they face in their community? What are their dreams about who they want to become and how they want to provide for their children and their families? You just get to skip all that. I don't want to hear those voices. They don't serve my biases. And so I'm just not going to hear those voices. It's a shortcut. It's a cynical shortcut because it cuts out the voices that are part of what I think is the most sacred act or opportunity in this country. I don't think we're doing it well, but I think we could be doing it, which is to sit together and negotiate and tell our stories. This is my family's life. This is our experience. This is where we're hurting. It's where we need help. It's where we could see the country going. What is yours? And it sidesteps the candidate's responsibility to articulate their own vision of the world that they want, that they are committed to working towards. They don't have to get buy-in from anybody. They don't have to get anybody invested. They don't have to evolve their own vision based on what they hear, because they hear nothing. They just squish the voice. So if it is such a huge value in our country, and I believe it is both written and faithfully, a deep value in our country that every voice gets to be heard in this structure that we've created, then what does it mean when the cruel and silencing, proactive, strategic act to get the thing to go your way is to suppress that voice? So here's what I think that faith communities can do, what we're doing over at CBE. There's a few things I wanted to share. One is just do everything you can. I don't mean unstrategically jump around in a circle. I mean there are lots of ways that we can help. So if you are a person who can challenge it in the courts and that's your role, go challenge it in the courts. You take that baton and you go do that. If you are a person or a community that can send thousands of postcards to voters through nonpartisan organizations like Reclaim Our Vote, then send thousands of postcards with real information like voting times and voting places that are true. If you can drive seniors to the polls, get your car out there, go get some seniors, ask their permission, don't just drive them to the polls, but seniors who want to go to the polls, help them get there in your own vehicle. If you are a person who can train to be an election worker come November, you can train with A More Perfect Union. It's a wonderful organization. If you can get on a bus and go learn to have a real conversation with somebody who's been told that their voice doesn't count, go join Changing the Conversation Together and learn how to deep canvas and invite people to remember that their voice and their stories matter. You can join, if you're in a Jewish congregation, the Reform Movement's Every Voice, Every Vote campaign. If you want to talk about partisan things, which we are not allowed to, and so I will not, go Google the States Project and go have a great time with it. I'm not going to tell you anything about it, but it's brilliant work. If you have access to a microphone and a stage, grab the microphone and start talking into it. So that's what I would say. If we can have less fear about what we'll hear, then we have a better shot at remembering that we have to listen to every voice and making room for that.
Stephanie, that was terrific. Carol, do you want to add anything or add your own perspective concerning current attempts to restrict voting?
Well, the thing that I would just add, I'm so thankful, Stephanie, that you gave us tangible things that we all can do. And of course, as people of faith, we do have some microphones that we can use. But, Mubarak, you brought up the learnings or a learning from the pandemic. And that was one thing that was beautiful having to do with democracy, is that during the pandemic, we had better access to voting. I'm in Kentucky, and we've never had early voting until the pandemic. And luckily, Kentucky is one of the states that has continued that, not as long as so many beautiful states that allow you to do it for a long time, but the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday before Election Day, they actually have early voting in Kentucky now. So I'm very thankful for that. But going back to the picture that COVID gave us for voting, we had better access. We had no excuse. Absentee ballots. We could mail our ballots, or we could drive and drop them in a box. They just really made it so easy. So we know that it can be done. And so I hold on to that maybe some little gains. Unfortunately, after the pandemic, there were some leaps backwards, and we have to raise that up, shine light on those, because oftentimes when I talk to people who live in states that have easier access to voting, let me say, they are shocked to learn how difficult it is in some states, and Kentucky is one of those, although not as tough as Alabama, for instance. Yeah.
Mubarak, you have anything to add about current attempts to restrict voting and what concerns you the most about that?
Yeah, we're struggling with this also here. We had some for some seats that you run for. It's called at-large seats, and usually in the at-large seats is really like sometimes it just like the voices of that specific group or representation from a specific community get really diluted. And representation matters. People actually look at their representatives as the symbol of democracy in their town or in their small community, where this is the person that actually I voted for, or I expect that is going to represent my agenda, and that's very important to build that within the smaller community, so you can, for people to trust democracy, then that they can actually even think that it speaks for them and it represents them in some way and it serves their interest. And sometimes the thing about when we have this disconnect between communities and representation, that's when we start like losing touch with even the systems of government, which is the democracy itself, and we don't want that to happen at all. So
indeed.
And then in the voting, and how do we really look at that as something that we encourage people to do and support people in doing. And we try to do, like, we're privileged here in Seattle because we have the mail-in votes, so we kind of we have that system where we don't have to stand in line for like hours or any of that. At the same time, but we still struggle with really struggle with some of the remote areas, and how and the time that those votes gets in. So it's still like it's not a perfect system, but at the same time it actually gives people a little bit more better chance than just all or everybody fight the same day to get their ballot in.
So Mubarak, I want you to respond to this next question first, and it goes like this: some faith traditions resist bringing anything that might seem political into the pulpit. What about yours as a Muslim? How might your imams most faithfully navigate these ways of faith to speak to the public sphere? Tell us about that.
So again, I'm leaning into the learning phase. We are still in the learning phase. Most of our community is really based on immigrants and people that we have a larger group of from the Muslim community or from the African American communities, and they navigated this for a long time through the civil rights, through other things. But again, with the when you have a large part of your population or from the Muslim community is immigrants, there's a lot of learning that you have to to do, and also just introducing these systems and bring that system into the the worship space, spiritual space, is really hard. Okay, and here we're going to talk about a few things. Yes, we have a system that calls for all of us to express our opinions freely and openly, and that's what the democracy is. But now when you go to the, to the mosque or the, whatever your worship space is, then you find yourself really confronted by specific rules that you have to follow. Okay. And those rules are kind of, one of them is like, again, the government has to give you a code. This is your code, and this is what you're allowed to say, and this is what you're not allowed to say. Otherwise, you kind of navigating that. The other thing is like, also the community itself, is the community ready for political conversation? Or is this a political conversation or a faith, spiritual conversation? How do you tie those two? So we're doing a lot of work with our imams, who these are our spiritual leaders, to help them really navigate that, because all of their training was on the spiritual path. Okay, now we're coming to talk to them like almost talking to them with a different set of language. I give you an example. Take some of the issues that are centered today to the conversation around our democracy. Is it the function of, do I have a right, right to vote? Do I have the right to, express or do I have the right over my body? Do I have the right over my, this? Then how do you center those conversations in a pulpit so people can tie these in? And because it has two sides. One side is really when they talk about it from a religious ideology, and here's what my faith is telling me. But at the same time, when you get to the nuance, you find out this is really a completely different conversation. It does not really, have to condone everything about this particular issue. But then, what are we discussing at this in this point of time, and about this specific issue? Are we talking about civil rights, human rights? Are we talking about personal freedom, and what does your faith say about that? Okay, and things like that. So when we get to the nuance, the conversation becomes a little bit more easy to approach. So sometimes it's really hard, right? Okay, so there is no one set of way or answer, but I just tell you, it's a struggle, and we've been working on it. And I think we made a huge progress, because now at least we moved like 20 years ago. If you bring in somebody who is running for office in a mosque, I'm telling you, it's going to tell you, no, we don't really do politics. You guys go do your politics somewhere else. Okay. So come 2020, I think now in 2024, I think we made a really good progress now. We can talk about that. Okay.
Thank you, Mubarak. Carol, do you have something to add to that?
Yes. I was a pastor for 14 years, and I think that it is really important that we be preaching on this, talking about it with our young people. I was blessed to grow up in a family that really took voting seriously, and I raised my own children that way, but I recognize that not everybody grows up that way. So talking with the youth of my congregation about registering as soon as you're 18, and taking this as a right and a responsibility to live out your faith in this way. I guess my suggestion, and what I tell other clergy to do when they're wanting to talk or speak or preach on voting or anything that is now deemed political, which now it seems like everything is just stay with the holy text. So as long as we Christians are preaching the gospel, as we say, but whatever the faith, when you preach out from the ancient texts and you stay in those, of course, making references to how we live that out today, but you can't go wrong, right? We're not encouraging people to vote for one candidate or one party or one issue, but asking you to get in touch with your own faith and what is important to you and what do you believe, and then how do I live that out? I used to ask my congregation probably too many times, what decision do you make that is disconnected from your faith, that it isn't part of your faith? That should be no decision. And so the same would be true of this, that as we are living out our faith, to not vote is not participating in a right and responsibility. But I also think in the same way that we can't only be concerned with ourselves and our family, that we aren't just called to do our part and to go and vote ourselves, but taking what Stephanie shared of so many different ways that we can engage, we are called to care for the others as well, and the whole community. So that could look like your youth, it could look like your congregation. And for me personally, because I have young adult children and their friends are part of that age where you aren't necessarily settled, and so they're living in different places. And so part of what I take on is to say, have you registered to vote? If you haven't registered to vote where you're now living, then do you know the rules of what you need to do to vote absentee? And I will find those rules for them and get those to them. So I think it's important for us and all those who are listening today to know that we need to think about who's the community that I can also help vote. Who are the ones that I can give a ride to, or that I can make sure that they know how to vote and what the dates are and what the processes are. But particularly, like, don't make your list of 10 people you're going to check in with the people who always vote at every election. Make a list of people who might really need a little extra support. So I may have gone outside of the question there a little bit, but
That's it. No problem. Stephanie, would you like to add something to this?
Sure. Just because I think it's such an important question. I love listening to what's happening in the Muslim community that you're talking about, and your community, Carol, that you're talking about, as we all grapple with this. And I think one other way to come at this is just to remember that there's a difference between the laws, which are, we shouldn't be partisan, that there are hard rules to follow, that we can't advocate for a particular candidate. And then there's our values. And I think there's a fear of this word political because everything is political now. Climate, for goodness sake, the planet, Earth. This was not political back not that long ago. And now it's not just political, it is partisan. But like, how do we in congregations talk about it? The Reform movement in the Jewish world is a prophetic movement. We have been talking about justice since, inception, or certainly in the civil rights movement, and having taken part in some of these great moments in Jewish history or in American history, and yet there's still congregants who feel uncomfortable, hearing in various different places, not in Brooklyn as much, but in other places, there can certainly be deep discomfort. But this is what I want to suggest, and certainly how I think about it. I don't know a more political document than the Torah. It's a story, right? Our most formative narrative is a story of Moses going to Pharaoh and speaking truth to power, and a people raising themselves up out of oppression to become free and to figure out what it means to now live as free people amongst other peoples, and how to use resources to care for other and the most vulnerable, and the orphan and the widow and the stranger. And of course, it's not just Torah, it's the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the prophets. These are stories of how do we, there's the words of the prophets who shout from the depths of their soul to get us to pay attention, to not just sacrifice bulls, but to take care of the most vulnerable in our communities, and to stop oppressing other people while we're singing our nice songs. It's about just a whole world of how do we take care of each other. That is a political question. And the way we can know that immediately for sure is that there was such a thing as the slave Bible, where they took out all notions of the freedom parts of the story, because they were actually worried that people would take this thing seriously and that Black folks would rise up and throw off their chains, because this was the sacred text that they would read, and they believed that there was so much power in it that it would change how people expected and believed that they were worthy of living. And you know, the politics itself, this scary, scary word, it comes from the word the polis, right? The center of Greek society where the people would gather to negotiate how they were going to live their lives with each other and which rules were going to exist so that the least of the community and the most powerful of the community and the wealthiest and the people of the least could all survive this together, and that things would be as fair as they could be, as compassionate as they could be, told everybody. So I would say Torah and faith, these are political questions. Pretending faith is not political, or pretending our sacred texts are not political documents, feels like a fearful act. If a text comes to teach us how to take care of each other, then it is in fact a beautifully political text. I think we have to be really careful, like, to not let what we talk about as political turn us against each other and close our ears towards each other, no matter who is this other. And not allow this current definition of politics to sully what is unbelievably beautiful, a shared set of traditions, each in our own way, and not just our traditions, but beyond our Abrahamic traditions as well, to just try to figure out how to be human in a world where it's really hard to be human.
Yeah. Wow, you gave us so much there, Rabbi. Thank you. We're a little short on time. We're gonna go to our last question here, which in some ways brings it all together. I'm not sure who to turn to first, so I'll just put the question out there, and whoever speaks up can just take it away. What relationships do you see between truth and hope? I said a little bit about that in my opening comments, but which of you would like to share your views first? Who's ready?
I can jump in.
Go, Carol.
I think it's a really interesting, it's a really interesting thing for all of us to chew on and think about for a minute. But going back to one of my first statements about being snowed over by the fossil fuel companies, the plastic companies, and they did such a good job at convincing us that all the problems were ours. Unless we know the real story, and unless we shine light on the situation as it is, then we can't address it and we can't move towards a better world, right? And so, you know, God doesn't call us, our Creator doesn't call us for that pie in the sky kind of rainbows and butterflies kind of hope, but one that is really grounded in justice. And, you know, we always say we work for peace through justice, or with justice, and justice, that they go together. So we can't have hope that isn't grounded deeply in our faith, that is a truth that is that we can stand on, and truth in both factual, but also truth that comes from who we are, whose we are, and how we're called to live. So that truth, right? That truth. It can't be, you know, empty. It has to be grounded. And I'm blessed to be a part of a denomination that reason has always been very critical, and that questioning our faith is very critical. And so I say, from that, we are called to not be comfortable. And so sometimes being critical and thoughtful and using our reason and searching for the truth can make us very uncomfortable. But we can't have hope and work towards hope without it, whether it be climate or any injustice.
Carol, thank you for that. And speaking for the UCC, I would just ditto what you said. Mubarak, truth and hope, how do they come together for you and for the Muslim tradition?
Well, hope is really more of what we think of as the guidance for what we live for. And without hope, we don't feel like, you know, there is so much, you know, to think about in terms of turmoils, difficulty, and you know, struggles that we have. Now, hope is really what the light that actually really guide us towards, you know, how do we think about we make the world a better place than we found it, you know, how we think about, you know, how do we bring in truth to our life, you know, it's like more of the trustworthiness of, as you know, as we are, you know, living through these struggles and things like the Rabbi Stephanie was talking about in terms of, you know, the guiding was are we guided by the faith that we have, and how are we, you know, practicing that in terms of hope for ourselves and giving hope for others, that this is something that is, you know, beautiful. This is something that we can have, we can be harmonious. We can actually, you know, bring different voices together. We can make even the one voice matter, and then we make people believe in the system of government, the system of, you know, the life we're living in. And through that, I look at, you know, what do we support and promote? And we do support and promote the one that aim for just an inclusive, you know, world. And inclusivity here is really not meant for just one thing. It's really more of there is that level of interdependency, interconnectivity, everything. And we bring that all together so we can actually give hope for the world and for others, you know, to come together with us on this journey. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Rabbi, close us out with your responses to truth and hope and how they relate.
So there's a tradition, a Jewish tradition, where we say Elu ve'elu. These and these are the words of the living God. And when we talk about truth, it's important, I think, to also acknowledge that not one of us knows for sure that we are the ones who hold a truth. That would be hubris. So there's a difference between, I think, truth and lies, and allowing for multiple truths to live. The Talmud as a document that doesn't just take the like, and this is the solution, but it retains the minority opinion and discussion and the discourse so that we could seek truth. So that's, you know, when we think about truth, like to come at this with an honest desire to see what is true and not declare, I have the truth, you know, as opposed to you or our traditions, and to be able to live in a listening and curious world with integrity. And yeah, so I want to take that piece, like, what do we mean when we say truth? And also acknowledge that, like, today there's like a redefinition of what is true. And sometimes people just make up new facts or alternative facts. And then we're all just supposed to believe those facts. It's very hard to know what is true. And the world is too big and there's so much information coming at us all the time. So what do we do with truth and hope? The Jewish tradition, at least as many of us do, sort of points ourselves towards a better world. It says, like, there's a world out there where every person can sit under their own vine and fig tree and none will make them afraid. And the nations will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and we won't learn war anymore. And justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And so, you know, the lion and lambs and all of the things. So how does truth and hope have to do with each other? I think it has something to do with that vision and our ability and commitment and courage to imagine the future as we want it to be, the future that is inclusive, Mubarak, as you talked about in the future, that is, you know, able to hold all of these ideas. And if we don't arrive there, then we didn't follow a true path. If we didn't arrive at the place that we so deeply hope for. So like the proof is in this proverbial pudding. You know, did we listen to each other? Did we dream something up together that would work for people, that would care for the vulnerable, that would break down the structures of racism and homophobia and anti-Semitism and xenophobia? Did we do the thing? Did we find the truth in humanity? And if we did, are we pointed towards a vision of greater hope for all people? And if we're not, or we can't even articulate it, or we're lost, then I think we haven't really found our shared truth yet. And we have a lot of work to do still.
Listen, I can't thank the three of you enough. This has been a profound sharing. And I'm sure I speak for everybody that is listening now and those who will hear the recording later. I want to wrap this up by offering some action items. And you heard a few from what we've all said, but let me just be quite quick and quite specific. We need to learn more about the challenges that are plaguing our democracy now. And a good place to start is to learn about this movement that I mentioned in my opening comments, Faiths United to Save Democracy. Even though they're focusing on a state that may not be your own state, they are so good at doing this. Their principles will apply wherever you're living. And, you know, another learning step is to just read one of the many excellent books that have come out over the past several months on the threat to our democracy. Jim Wallace's book, The False White Gospel, is one of them, but there are countless others. It's too many for me to name. You know, it might feel awkward, but it's important to talk about our right to vote and how it is currently being threatened. And Carol, I think, mentioned this in some of her comments, but it's implicit in what all of us said. And if you're feeling isolated in relation to this, what we're talking about today, reach out to others. And one way to connect with others is what you're doing right now. That is through Third Act. If you go to the Third Act website, you're going to find a variety of ways in which you can join with others and address this issue. And I'm just going to leave you with two opportunities. The first is to sign up to write postcards to voters in 2024. Third Act is making this possible. You can find it on the thirdact.org website. Another opportunity is to sign up to register seniors in high school to vote. So the way Third Act talks about this is senior to senior, because those of us that are in Third Act are, of course, seniors. And again, the way in which you can accomplish this, it's all provided on the Third Act website. It turns out every year 4 million Americans turn 18 and become eligible to vote, but fewer than half of them vote. However, once they are registered, 75% of them vote in presidential elections. One last thing. As a follow-up to tonight's conversation, it's likely that Third Act Faith will be offering an opportunity for clergy to consider the crucial role God is calling them to play as the election nears. We're contemplating a webinar that will likely be scheduled for late August or early September for clergy to talk about preaching an election sermon and also the sacred right to vote. So when you receive an email announcement about this program, I would just urge you to please share it with your clergy and ask those clergy to share it with their colleagues. So now, Rua, I want to turn it back to you to wrap us up. Thank you.
Muted. Oh, we didn't get a chance to have any questions come for you all.
And Rua, if you could let Ace, she's got something to sum things up, and then you can jump back in. Is that okay?
Yeah, that I think Ace should be at least one.
Thank you so much, everyone, for remembering that I am in charge of Q&A, and I've been looking through the chat, and there's been some really great questions, but I feel like, you know, a question pops up and one of you was able to answer it in your comments. So hopefully people listened well and clearly to you. And I just want to remind all of our listeners tonight that this has been taped, and you can go back to it. You can read listen to it. Our newsletter will probably have a long story about this. I'm guessing Jane Ellen is somewhere in this crowd. And so look for your newsletter. This was such a rich and fabulous evening. We really appreciate that the four of you put yourselves into this conversation with all your heart and soul from 3 different faiths, if not more, at least different dimensions of each of these faiths. So we really thank you. I think I just want to highlight that, and by the way, I have like 20 questions of my own that I could have asked you, but you know what? The best program is when you have so much to say that the rest of us are just wanting more afterwards. So please, everyone, especially I think for leading up to and the day of what Stephanie suggested about all the various ways that you can get people in your communities to be activated to go out and do what each of them need to do. I really think that was very helpful. And the final takeaway I would say is that it really behooves each of us to know our own communities, our synagogues, our churches, our mosques, and to reach out to the people that we already know well and say, hey, how about that son of yours that moved to that state? Is he registered in his new state? Love that, Carol. So thank you. Mubarak, the way that you bring in people who are just learning about democracy and how important it is, that was wonderful as well. So I just want to thank you. And the questions will just have to be in the atmosphere for all of us to chew on. So Ruah, now you.
Oh, goodness gracious. Yes, it's a very, very hard act to follow here. It was wonderful from every one of you. I feel like I learned a lot tonight. So what I'm going to do is just share a few organizations that we've not heard yet from what's been suggested. But just going back to Third Act Faith, the next online contemplative practice is going to be on May 30th, and it's going to be led by Stephen Posner, so Director of Pathways to Planetary Health with the Garrison Institute. So if you find Third Act Faith, you'll find other programs that we're supporting. Another organization that I've been involved with is Interfaith Power and Light. They have a Faith Votes program. And I'm just going to share the pledge because I think it addresses a lot of what we were talking about tonight, or you all were talking. I was listening. I pledge to care for creation and protect my neighbors. I pledge to vote and to care for every living creature in every community suffering the impacts of our changing climate, from extreme heat to wildfires, fires, to devastating droughts, to flooding, to more infrequent and supercharged storms, by pledging to be a consistent voter and to vote with the climate justice in mind. I am communicating my faithful values of caring for our sacred earth for current and future generations and building a better world for us all. I just think that it says it all, doesn't it? But what's exciting is that so many faith groups are working on the democracy issues, and the UCC, we have heard here, and which is the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign. Interfaith America has a Faith in Elections playbook that supports faith-based civic and campus communities with accessible, actionable resources. And Faith in Action, which is a large grassroots global faith-based organizing network. Working nonpartisan organization, works with 1,000 congregations in more than 200 cities and towns through its 46 local and state federations, as well as in Haiti, Central America, Africa, and Eastern Europe. And there are two others for us to be aware of: EcoAmerica.org that has a Get Out the Vote 2024, and poorpeoplescampaign.org. So, you know, we all hope that you find inspiration from the amazing speakers this evening and from one or more of these very fine organizations that are working for us to have a fair election. And that fairness means that everyone has the right to vote, the sacred right to vote, and that it's easy to vote. So I think that that brings us to a time where we can really appreciate a closing song. And it's called "The Tide is Rising." And it comes with a video. And it was written by Rabbi Shoshona Meira and is sung by Annie Patterson, who is the co-author of the Rise Up Singing books.
The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The task is mighty, and so are we. The task is mighty, and so are we. The task is mighty, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. This land is holy, and so are we. This land is holy, and so are we. This land is holy, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The storm is raging, and so are we. The storm is raging, and so are we. The storm is raging, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The sun is shining, and so are we. The sun is shining, and so are we. The sun is shining, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The world is ready, and so are we. The world is ready, and so are we. The world is ready, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be.